Welcome everybody to the second of this three webinar mini series on Irish dairy farming and dairy grazing. My name is John Winston. I'm an agricultural economist. This webinar series is an activity of a project that I'm coordinating with funding from the Northeast Dairy Business Innovation Center. And the series is also an activity of a project coordinated by the Wallace Center at Winrock International. And that project is funded by the Great Lakes Protection Fund. Our goal is to help dairy grazing become an important part of the U.S. dairy sector. And the reasons that we are trying to do this is because we know dairy grazing can be profitable. We know it can help farms be more nimble, more resilient, and more flexible. And we know it's good for the cows, and it's good for the soil, and it's good for the environment. And unfortunately, dairy grazing is not currently part of the playbook for the future of U.S. dairy. And we feel that it should be, and we want to make it so. So we'll put a couple of flyers with information on the two projects that I mentioned into the chat. There they are. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. So this is the second webinar in the three-part series. And today's webinar will focus on pasture management and wintering systems in Ireland. The first webinar, in case you weren't able to join us, was an overview of Irish dairy farming. And that recording is available. You should have received it with an email that I sent yesterday as a reminder to this webinar. And so there's a link to it. It's a YouTube, it's up on YouTube. So if you don't see it, check your spam or junk mail folders. It should be there. The third webinar is going to be on March 12th. That's in 3 weeks from today, not 2 weeks. So just be aware of that different cadence. It's going to be at the same time. And when you registered for this, you got registered for the entire series. So you should have the Zoom information that's needed to get into that one on March 12th. And based on the input that you all have provided, that webinar is going to focus on the important considerations for achieving a tight calving interval and dealing with the ramifications of managing a seasonal operation. And we will also allow more time for Q&A during that third webinar to try to answer some additional questions that you may have. So once again, I am very happy to be able to introduce Dr. Padraig French as our presenter today. He works with Teagasc, and he's based in Moorpark in the southern part of the Republic of Ireland. He's the head of the Livestock Systems Department. And his research has included dairy farm systems, low-cost wintering systems, grassland management, dairy calf to beef production, and ruminant nutrition. He's worked on research projects in the UK, New Zealand, Tanzania, and he's the past president of the Irish Grassland Association. And importantly, he also owns and runs a dairy farm. So before I turn it over to Padraig, just a reminder, please keep your microphones muted unless you're intentionally trying to say something to the group. And that's especially important during his presentation because background noise can be a little disruptive. We will allow time for Q&A at the end of this webinar, and you're welcome to put questions into the chat during his presentation, and we will try our best to manage those and put like questions together and get as many answered as possible. You'll also be able to use the raise hand function in Zoom, which is at the bottom of your screen. It is under
It's in React.
in React, right? So in mine, it shows a heart. So you hit the React button, and then there's a raise hand bar there. Uh, and so that's probably the best way to get into the queue for saying something. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Padraig French for today's webinar. Thank you very much for being here, and thanks, Padraig.
Okay, thanks, John. Hope you all can hear me okay. And as John said, I'm going to, I suppose, dig deeper into, I suppose, one of the aspects that we discussed 2 weeks ago, and that's going to focus on grassland or grazing management in Ireland, and hopefully that you can get something out of it that's of relevant to your farms that you're working with in the USA. Okay, so I'm not moving on. Right. So this actual graph I presented last or 2 weeks ago as well, and it's really highlighting why grassland is so important for us and for anyone in pasture-based systems. And this is replicable anywhere in the world where you have grass-based systems, is that as you increase the amount of grass consumed by the animals, you increase profitability. So this data that you're looking at there, each of those dots represents a farm data, and it relates the tons of grass utilized by the farm to profit. Okay, and profit per hectare on the left-hand axis, on the y-axis, and tons of grass utilized on the x-axis. And there's a lot of things affect profit on a dairy farm. But by far, the biggest in a pasture-based system is the amount of grass utilized. Tons of grass utilized is what drives profit, simply because grass that's utilized in situ is relatively cheap feed, and it's high quality feed that can produce a lot of milk. And there's a margin in turning grass into milk. Okay. And the more of it you do, the more potential margin there is for the farm. And we've looked at this across many countries and across many different systems in Ireland and across multiple years. And in all cases, we would have found that it explains between 40 and 50% of the variation in profit on farm, which is far more significant than any other variable. Okay, so if we're accepting that grass utilized is a key driver of profit, how do we set up our farms to ensure high grass utilization? And what I'm going to focus on today is a little bit first about the infrastructure for good, high grass utilization, and after that, focusing in on the tools that we use for it. And the last part of the talk, I'm going to focus a little bit on the wintering options that we use in Ireland to get through that period when we don't have grass. I suppose the first thing on a pasture-based dairy farm is having the proper infrastructure, having the infrastructure available to achieve high grass utilization. And by infrastructure, we mean farm roadways, paddocks, water infrastructure, so that the farm can be laid out to efficiently, labor efficiently utilize grass. And we are always talking about rotational grazing systems. Okay. The systems are set up that, we can graze the cows in a paddock. So for 24 to 36 hours. And I'll explain why in a minute that we set the system up like that. Typically on a dairy farm, like in Ireland or anywhere in the world where you're pasture, you focus on what we call the milking platform. This is the area that the cows can walk to every day. Okay, that's our primary focus, the milking platform, the area that you can walk cows to. And we subdivide that into paddocks, depending on grass production, depending on grass growth, such that the entire herd of cows will graze one paddock in 24 to 36 hours. And the infrastructure, the roadways are there to get the cows to each paddock, and there's water and fences on each paddock so that they can remain there for, go back there after 2 or 3 grazings. Typically at peak grass growth in Ireland, we're operating about a 21 day rotation for the main grazing season. So somewhere about 25 to 30 paddocks will be adequate, with some of those paddocks closed up for silage at different times. And I'll go through that in more detail. We have roadways set up. These are, I suppose, constructed from a mixture of clay and stone to provide a durable, hard surface to for the cows to walk on. There's a lot of, I suppose, effort goes into designing those roads in terms of shape, size, and surface, that they're suitable for the cows to walk on, and that the cows can be moved fast from any one paddock to the farmyard. And there's water systems set up in each paddock for the cows while they're there. Now, our cows are normally milked twice a day. So if you're at a 36-hour paddock, then they're going back into each paddock 3 times in the rotation, 3 times consecutively. Just in terms of the paddock system and how many paddocks and why we're in a paddock. So if we have a small number of paddocks and we're a long residency time in a paddock, okay? If you're in a small number of paddocks and you're 3 to 4, 5, 6 days in a paddock, the net effect of that is that the cows are eating the regrowths, okay? And if the cows are eating the regrowths, you're going to significantly reduce grass production. If we, I suppose, stop and think about how grass grows, I suppose once grass is grazed, it immediately will draw on its energy reserves to send up the first leaf. And that leaf will start photosynthesizing and start replenishing the energy reserves. And over about 10 to 11 days, a new leaf will appear, and then the third leaf will appear. And that at that stage, you've reached the optimum in terms of grass growth, okay, and energy reserves. So you're always trying to balance the quality of what the animal is eat and the ability of the pasture to grow. But you need to let it grow to approximately the third leaf stage before you graze the actual plant, to allow it to replenish the energy reserves in its roots. If you're in a paddock, if you're set stocking, continuous grazing in the same paddock, or long residency times of 5, 6, 7 days in a paddock, then you're going to have reduced grass production overall. Okay. Reducing from, say, 5 day paddocks down to 3 to 4 days per paddock, you still have, I suppose, a small reduction. Whereas if you move, I suppose, to the extreme where we operate at, which is 1 to 1.5 days per paddock, you're not eating the regrowths. The cows are being less restricted, and they would be if they were getting, say, a 12-hour grazing break. And you optimize grass growth, grass utilization, and quality. And it's a happy balance between trying to fully feed the cows and trying to have to utilize the grass at the right level. Okay. So going back to a graph that I would have shown you last week, and it would be the grass growth and the demand of the herd. So our cows, generally, we're stocked at approximately 1 cow per acre, 2.5 cows per hectare. And the blue line there represents grass demand, and the green line representing grass growth. Okay. It's measured in kilograms per hectare, but if you just multiply by 0.9, you'll get to pounds per acre. Okay. If that's the currency you're using. So the green line, I say we have very little grass growth during the winter, just starting to take off now in mid-February. We reach peak growth by late April, early May. Relatively good growth through the summer if we don't get a drought. And then sometime in October, early October, grass growth will drop below demand and we'll have a deficit. Okay, so we calve in February. We're calving full steam at the moment. And as the cows are calved, they go to grass. And for this period, we know that we're going to have a deficit. We're not growing enough grass to feed the cows at the moment. So what we do, we want to keep grass in the cow's diet as much as possible because it's a high quality feed, it's high protein, and we can supplement them with a lot if they need supplementation with relatively lower cost feed. Okay. So, and it also is a feed that can give you high intake. So our key strategy is during these periods of deficit is trying to keep grass in the cow's diet to some level and yet not overgraze the farm. So the way we set up through these two periods is through an area allocation. So we'll allocate an area of the farm every day to the cows until we reach this day in early April, which we call Magic Day, which is when grass growth equals demand. Okay? We'll generate a surplus for most of the summer, and during that period, we'll have to manage that surplus, and it's really about controlling the surplus and maintaining grass quality before we head into a deficit again in the autumn. Okay, and we're going to go through the management tools that we use to deal with the surpluses and deficits. So we have a tool. It's a decision support tool called the Pasture-Based Ireland. It's a national grassland database. So each farmer has their own login. They log into this system. It will have all their data saved, right, their paddock numbers, and there's an awful lot of functionality in this that won't go through, but it has all their paddock data. They'll walk the farm and they'll just input the farm cover. They'll use it to do their spring rotation planner. They'll use it to input all their fertilizers. Even the milk production data all is fed into this. So quite a functional tool that farmers use as a management tool on a week-to-week basis. But for managing their pastures, they're dealing with three tools. And it's coming back to this, I suppose it's just drawn slightly differently here, but like the green here represents grass growth, and the red line represents the demand. And you can see the deficit in spring and the deficit here in the autumn. And the three tools that we're using through the spring, we use a spring rotation planner, which is just an area allocator. During the summer months, and we'll discuss this in more detail, we use the thing called the grass wedge. And again in the autumn, we use a rotation planner to get enough to set the farm up for the spring and to allocate the grass through the autumn to ensure that we have grass in the diet right through till the end of lactation. So the autumn, I suppose it's an area-based allocation again, and the focus is on grazing the entire farm between, depending on the part of the country, sometime in late September, very early October, we'll begin the last rotation. And we'll gradually slow down the rotation to ensure we have grass in the diet right to the end of lactation, be that in late November, early December. And if there's not enough feed in the area that's allocated every day to the cows, as we slow down the rotation, we have to buffer up that and feed other supplement, be it silage or grain, to fill the deficits. Okay? And once those paddocks are grazed in October, November, they're not touched again until the following spring. Okay? So it's a set area every day, and the grass is continuing to grow through October into early November, and that grass that grows in that period will be available in early spring when grass has a higher feed value in a freshly calved cow. Similarly, in the spring, we allocate on a daily basis a specific area to the cows. As the cows start to calve, we turn them out to pasture, and we allocate them a specific area every day. And that area gradually increases as the number of cows have calved. But the key is to ensure that the first rotation lasts until we meet that day when grass growth exceeds demand. Okay, so this rotation planner, it's just a tool that the farmers use. They just input when their first cow is due to calve, when their magic day is, the total area and the total number of cows, and it will calculate an area allocation. It'll work out a feed budget for the cows so that they can look at how much supplement do I have to feed during the period from early February when they start calving until early April when the grass growth meets demand. Okay, so it's a simple enough tool based on an area allocation and filling the deficit with supplement, but ensuring that there's grass in the diet right through both for the spring and the autumn. The main grazing season then, I suppose, is when most of the grass grows from early April through to, well, depending on the time of year, mid-August, we start increasing the rotation length. But the key to us at that time is we're balancing optimizing growth and the quality of the pasture in front of the animals. So we have set a target that to optimize growth and to optimize grass quality, we need between 14 and 1600 kilos of dry matter. That's between 1250 and 1430 pounds per acre of grass dry matter. And when we define grass dry matter per acre or per hectare, it's what's available above a cutting height of 4 centimeters. Okay. So that's about what, an inch and a half of a residual height. That's what's available that the animals can eat. Typically in April through to August, we will grow that in 20 days. Now, that's an average. It's never average. It can range. We can grow it at its peak. We could grow it in 10, 12 days. If we hit poor growth because of temperature or weather or drought, it could take 50 days. And we have to slow the rotation down to match that. Okay. Or we speed it up to match it if the growth is. The key to it all, though, is, as we say, pasture management is not a spectator sport. You know, it's a something that has to be managed on a week-to-week basis. So the farmers will go out and walk the farm every week. And we would say to farmers, when things are really growing really fast, they need to go more than once per week. And this is they walk into each paddock. Now, some farmers do this by eye, some farmers do it with automated plate meters. And that one there, that guy is demonstrating, he's GPS tagged. So you walk in the field, it knows what paddock you're in. You just drop the plate meter, you measure the height of grass, it calculates the yield, and it uploads it automatically to, well, it Bluetooths it to the phone and uploads it to the database. And once you have walked the entire farm, the tool will draw this here, which is we call the feed wedge. And what this represents, the green bars represent each paddock on the farm. The width of the bar represents the size of the paddock. And the height of the bar represents the yield, going from the highest yielding, and it'll always graph it from the highest yielding to the lowest yielding paddock on the farm. And this is an ideal wedge because the red line represents a straight line from where you want it to be to the residual. Okay, so this is your ideal wedge. So the farmer will input how much grass, they'll walk each paddock, input the grass yield in each paddock. And then to get this red line, they'll input what is the demand, how many cows and how much grass per day are they eating. Okay, typically our cows will eat 16 to 18 kilos of grass dry matter, which is about 40 pounds. No, yeah, about 40 pounds, I think, of grass dry matter a day, approximately, maybe 37, 38 pounds of grass dry matter per day is what we're feeding our cows when we have enough grass. They're just getting on a grass only diet for that 5-6 months of the year. And based on that demand, it works out where this red line should be, and we can see how much grass we have on the farm. Okay, that's just the bottom there shows the input sheets that the farmer puts in, the number of animals, how much grass that they're eating, if they're getting any supplement or not, to calculate where the red line should be. This, I suppose, visually shows what the grass should look like. And it goes back to, I suppose, what I was talking about earlier was what's the optimum time to graze grass at. And this is, I suppose, for perennial ryegrass. If we graze it at too low a yield, we reduce significantly grass growth. Grass is only 1 or maybe 2 leaves, and you're depleting energy reserves in the sward, and your grass production will be reduced. This represents the optimum time. So grass is at a 3-leaf stage. So you're talking of probably 7 to 8 centimeters of a compressed height with a plate meter, or probably 10 to 11 centimeters of an extended sward height. So that's about 4 to 5 inches of a sward height is what you're looking at there. Okay. And I suppose this is at the extreme. If it's gone too high, you have a lot of elongation of the stem, and quality is deteriorating. A lot of senescence of that. You're now producing your new leaves all of the time, but the oldest leaf is senescence here at the bottom of the sward. So you have a lot of low digestibility, poor quality feed accumulating at the bottom of the sward. Unless you restrict cows really tightly, they won't graze down. and this stuff is unutilized. And if you force the cows to eat down into it, you will reduce intake and significantly reduce performance. Okay, so it's getting that balance right between optimizing production and feed value is somewhere there about. Okay. Just going back on the wage then, and when the farmer, I suppose this is, just showing an example of what happens if the farmer walks the farm and they find there's a deficit in the wage. And it'll look something like this. They'll see that, okay, I have enough grass for the cows today, but I'm not going to have enough grass for the cows to feed them next week. So the great, I suppose, advantage of this tool, it allows you to make the decisions sooner. And it allows you, the sooner you can make decisions, the more likely you are to make the right one, and the impact will be smaller. So the farmer is looking at the cows going into the paddock today, and it looks like there's loads of grass, so he's not concerned. But when they walk the farm, they can see that they're going to be short of grass in a week's time. And they can then slow down the rotation and extend out this grass, utilize this grass for longer, and keep grass in the cow's diet. If they do slow down the rotation, they either reduce the amount of ground closed up for silage, they supplement with silage or supplement with grain and extend out this grass. Okay. On the other hand, this is, I suppose, an example of a surplus wedge. And this shows, a lot of grass above the red line here. And the farmer can see that for the next week or two, a lot of grass coming ahead for the cows. And they know that they're going to have a significant surplus building ahead of them. So they need to do something about it. So they'll probably take out 1 or 2 paddocks here. They can do that and within the tool and see what impact it has on the wage and draw the wage without 1 or 2 or 3 of these paddocks. They'll harvest these paddocks immediately for silage and have them back in at the rotation. So they'll come in over here at a 0 farm cover. If they're harvested out, that silage should be relatively high quality feed at that stage, and it can be fed back again at some point later on to fill a deficit. One tool, just going to mention it briefly, is we have a thing called a pasture profit index. It's just a way of ranking grass varieties based on their profit potential. So looking at different varieties of perennial ryegrass or any other grass species and quantifying it's an economic index to quantify their value to our farmers. So all grass varieties all across Europe actually are evaluated under strict evaluation protocols. And the key traits we're looking at are their dry matter production in spring. This is up to early April. Their dry matter production during the summer and their dry matter production during the autumn. Their quality, their yield if they're harvested for silage, and their persistency, how long these ryegrass swards persist. This is, I suppose, important to us because it costs a lot of money to renew the swards. And from all of those, and as a weighted index, we calculate the profitability of that variety in a pasture-based system. Last area I want to talk on is winter in Ireland and how we cope with the winter. So I suppose I've gone through the spring, the summer and the autumn and how we manage grass. We're dealing with a deficit in the spring and autumn and we supplement the cows. And during the summer, I suppose we generally have adequate grass production. To put winter in Ireland in perspective, grass growth is pretty limited for about 3 months of the year because soil temperature is about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, okay, or about 5 degrees centigrade. And, it varies. I suppose we're at that threshold or that tipping point where if the winter is mild, we'll get some growth. And if the winter is below average, we get no growth, okay? And generally what we will do is we will take cows off pasture for between 2 to 3 months because of lack of growth. However, we also have a challenge. I suppose we are a long ways north, or much further north than anyone in the US other than Alaska. And for that reason, we get very little evaporation. And we get a lot of rain coming in, drifting in from the Atlantic, and our soils become saturated. And they can be saturated for up to 5-6 months for the heavier soils on the west coast. So our soils could be unsuitable for grazing from anywhere between 2 and 6 months of the winter. So we can have very long winters in certain parts of the country, which would be more similar to year length of winter, but for different reasons. It's just our soils will be too wet to actually put out cows to graze on them. So we have to feed the cows during that period, and it's the grass that we harvest as surplus. It's usually harvested as grass silage, and its harvest is as low dry matter grass silage because we have wet summers as well. And we feed that back during the winter ad lib to the cows, and usually during the dry period. And I suppose on the drier soils, where they have a 2 to 3 month winter, you're feeding back about a ton of dry matter per cow. On the heavier soils, where the wetter soils, it's about 1.5 tons dry matter per cow. In terms of the setup or the infrastructure to do that, I suppose we have just going to describe 3 different systems of which we winter cows to carry our cows through that period when the soils are too wet to graze and when we don't have enough grass. And I suppose the most conventional one would be similar to your freestall barns. We probably build them to much lower specification because our cows are predominantly dry cows. And I suppose the conventional would have the slurry stored underneath the cows as a liquid slurry, 6-7% dry matter. And the cows go in there, they can go in there at very late lactation or at the start of lactation, but is mostly used just for housing the dry cows. Because the cows are not lactating, there isn't the same requirement for space and that as they would for lactating cows. Okay, this system has relatively high capital costs. So to build this in Ireland today is probably costing between $2,500 and $3,000 per cow equivalent. It has low running costs, and it has limited enough flexibility. For farmers who are expanding a lot and who have big, I suppose, dairy herds, they operate lower cost systems. And I suppose farmers who are short of capital really, they use outdoor cubicles. So basically it's a freestall without any roof over it. Very minimalist, I suppose, infrastructure around it, no walls, nothing. So you just have the freestalls or the cubicles, and the slurry is all scraped into large lagoons. Okay, stored in lagoons at 2, 3, 4% dry matter and spread back out on the pasture in the spring. Okay, there are a lot of rules and regulations in Ireland around slurry storage requirements, and all farmers have to store all of the slurry produced from these systems and store it until it can be applied only when the grass is growing, which is not allowed from mid-September to mid-January. This system of outdoor cubicles and slurry storage lagoons generally cost between $1,000 to $1,500 per cow. Relatively low running costs as well, because you have no bedding requirement and limited enough flexibility in that they can only ever be used for dairy cows. The other system that farmers use, and these, I suppose, are really at the entry level where farmers need to get extra space for cows. And some farmers use it for part of their cows, they use it for calving cows on a lot, and they use it in the expansion phase, really, is using wood chip beds. So this is a layer of about probably close to a foot deep of wood chip over a layer of drainage stone with an impermeable barrier underneath. Cows lie on this. They have quite a large space allowance, 80 to 100 square foot per cow, and they're outdoors, obviously. Rain washes any of the soluble material down through the wood chip into the drainage layer and out through the drainage stone. And the cows lie on top, have a relatively comfortable bed and lots of space. All of the leachate is captured in lagoons. It's very low dry matter. It's the 1% dry matter. Because of the requirement for bedding, it has a high running costs and a lot of volume of slurry storage, but it is very flexible in terms of the animal type, including for calving cows on, and for any type of cow really, or young stock can be accommodated on, and it's also very comfortable as a structure for animals. Okay, so I think I have I think I've used all my time, John. And I suppose if you want to open it for questions on any of that areas, whether it's the wintering systems or the pasture-based pasture tools. I think you're muted, John.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that informative presentation and great timing. There is one question in the chat that I can see from Tim Terry, which says, are the 1 to 1.5 day paddocks further subdivided into half or thirds to give them a new section in addition to the prior section in each 12-hour period or not?
So in the spring and in the autumn, for when we're allocating an area per day, generally it will be subdivided. It will be so those paddocks will be subdivided to give them an allocation for 12 hours. So in the autumn, the paddock, okay, during the main grazing season, the paddock may graze them for 36 hours. But in the spring and autumn, we may need to get 48, 72 hours out of that paddock. So we will subdivide it and give them probably a 12-hour break. So after each milking, they'll get a new break. And that'll be subdivided with strip wires. But in the main grazing season, they won't. The cows will just enter them and they'll re-enter the same paddock for maybe 2 or 3 occasions. And at times, if the cows haven't grazed it to the optimum residual, they may go back in there just for a few hours post-grazing. Some farmers will do that. Other farmers will send back in a part of the herd to finish off the paddock. But we always try and hit the residuals, graze them down to that 1.5 inch residual.
Thank you very much. There are a couple of other questions that some of which have already been addressed. How do you strategize land management when stocking density is too high for the amount of accessible land? That's one that I think hasn't been been covered.
Yeah, it's a very good question. So overall, we are restricted to the overall stocking rate on the farm. Okay, so because of regulations around water quality and protecting water quality, we are restricted to a maximum overall farm stocking rate. Now, there's a lot of factors play into it, but it's approximately 1 cow per acre. Okay, lower yielding cows you're allowed slightly more, and higher yielding cows slightly less. But approximately for our cows, about 1 cow per acre of an area allocation. Now, for some farmers, that area is not all contiguous to the milking parlour. And the milking platform might be only a subsection of that, and therefore the stocking rate on the milking platform section could be much higher. And it could be 1.5 cows per acre. Usually that will be managed by silage will be harvested on the non-grazing area and brought back and fed to the cows. But that does reduce profitability. And once, I suppose our data would say, once you go above about 1.3, 1.4 cows per acre, it's not viable to have all that other land and driving. There's no advantage to go any higher in stocking rate than that. And we would have some farmers that would have gone beyond that in stocking rate. But the net benefit of it is very, very small. And okay, in years where you have high milk price, it'll make sense. In years when you have low milk price, it doesn't. Those cows are a liability because a lot of their feed, those extra cows, we call them marginal cows. Those cows that have too much for the stocking rate that you're carrying, and you're buying in feed to feed them, those cows are non-profit making.
Interesting. That it's quite different setup than we have in the US side, where it's only in rare places where there's any kind of regulation on that stocking rate.
Well, the stocking rate regulations is about protecting water quality, and it's driven by a nitrogen surplus that trying to minimize the amount of surplus nitrogen produced.
Understood. So there's three questions that are somewhat interrelated, two of them especially. And so let me put them all out onto the table. One of them asks, how do you feed the supplemental silage during the grazing season? Do you take them off the paddocks or bale graze on pastures? And then there was another question related to how is the silage stored generally on the farm? And then also how often do you renovate pastures and what's the process for that?
Okay, I'll start, I suppose, with the easy ones. How we store silage is a mixture of in bunkers and as bales. Generally, a proportion of the farm will be stopped for what we call first cut silage. So once we reach early April, it's our magic day when grass growth exceeds demand. We will stop up maybe 30–40% of the farm for 6 to 8 weeks and harvest it at quite a high yield of silage per hectare per acre. So about 10 tons fresh weight per acre will be harvested in late May, early June. Okay. That will be put into a bunker. It's low dry matter. It's 20% dry matter. It's pH of 4.1, and it will be fed back during the winter to the non-lactating cows. Okay. And it's a suitable feed for dry cows. And it's simplicity. Okay. Then for the rest of the season, we're dealing with surpluses, and we're walking the farm every week. And at any stage when we have a surplus, we will bale it, and that'll be harvested much lower yield. You're looking at 3 to 4 tons per acre. It's harvested, it's made into bales, high quality bales, and that is fed back when we have deficits to lactating cows. That can be in the spring, in the autumn, whenever the deficit arises. And it's fed in the same facilities as the cows are fed during the winter. So usually those facilities are contiguous to the milking parlour. They have the facilities for the cows to feed silage during the winter. So the cows come back to the yard at every milking. And if there's a deficit that there needs to be fed silage, they left into those facilities where they get to eat grass silage for maybe an hour, maybe 2 hours, and they'll eat enough silage to fill the deficit. So typically in the autumn, we'll work out that we have a certain area we can allocate every day to maintain our rotation. And that might provide 10, 11, 12 kilos of grass. We want to feed the cows 16, 17 kilos. They may get 2 kilos of grain in the milking parlour, maybe 3 kilos of grain in the milking parlour. And then they'll be left into the wintering unit for 2 hours to eat another 3 kilos of silage. Sorry, if it's 3 kilos of silage, they'll probably eat in less than an hour. Okay. And that's where they'll be fed usually. Yeah.
And are bales rolled out if it's the barn or the feeding pad or whatever in the examples you showed there? Is there a way to roll them out into some kind of a feed bunk, or how's that work?
So they're just usually taken out with a silage grab and just dropped in front of the head feed. And there is machines that will unroll them that some farmers use. But it's usually relatively basic equipment. It's not any sophisticated high capital system. You're just getting the silage in front of the cows.
Gotcha.
I don't know. Some people will use ring feeders, or familiar with those round feeders that you just drop them down over the bale and the cows come all around and eat the bale.
And you, of course, need to have enough
Space that they can all eat together, or in some cases they let half the cows in there and the other half to the paddock and buffer up half the cows,
Yeah. And then about a pasture renovation, how often does that happen and how is it done?
Okay, so our climate and our pests are such that perennial ryegrass can last pretty much indefinitely if it's managed properly. So there are paddocks that are 30, 40 years old and the sward is still as good as it was when it was 1 year old. However, because of usually mismanagement of some form, the sward will deteriorate, particularly if it's under silage. If there's a lot of silage being harvested, the sward will deteriorate over time. And typically, the time of the lifespan of a sward is between 10 and 20 years. So you're reseeding between regrassing or renovating between 5 and 10% of the pastures each year. It's done when we have a surplus. Okay, so that is not taken from our grazing season. So it's done between April and August. So we know that during that period we're going to have enough grass so we can afford to take some pastures out. Some farmers will incorporate crops in the rotation. So as part of the rotation to renew the pasture, they'll go from old pasture, cultivate, and incorporate winter crops that they can graze in situ, like kale, fodder rape, those type of crops, and graze them in situ during the winter and then regrass the following spring. And other farmers will incorporate short-term silage crops. So if they're cultivating in April, incorporate what we call arable silage, which is a mixture of peas and barley or peas and oats, grow it for about 2.5 months, harvest it for silage, and then put back into grass. That's just as break crops to not in case there's any, I suppose, permanent weeds that need to be knocked out. And then in terms of how we do it, it's usually done with minimum cultivation. We're not ploughing. So we usually either plough the sward or else use a glyphosate and kill off the old sward, one or the other. And if we're going with glyphosate, it's minimum tilling and it's just drilling back in new grasses or whatever new crop is going in there.
Padraig, I have a question for you that I was a bit surprised, given that strong correlation between grass utilization and profitability,
Yeah.
which is great to see. But then in the beginning of your presentation, to talk about that 1 to 1.5 day residence period per paddock. And in describing that, you said, well, the cows are less restricted than in a 12-hour break, right? Because they have more space.
They have more capacity to achieve their intake. They get higher intake.
Right.
Yeah.
But, and as you know, I'm an economist. I'm not a dairy farmer or an agronomist, but I think the conventional wisdom here has been, or at least used to be, that, move them as often as you can and force them to eat everything right down, but don't shortchange them. And it was really, I think, the 12-hour break is much more common. And so I wonder if you could just speak a little bit more on that.
Okay. So none of us are good enough at predicting how much the cows are going to eat because we don't have the accuracy to estimate the yield to the finite level, and we don't have, I suppose, the accuracy to measure how the cows will eat on any one day. If we put cows on a 12-hour grazing, yes, it makes it very easy to ensure that we will always graze it out to our target of 3.5, 4 centimeters, or about 1.5 inches. We will eat the sward out every time. And we could adjust the area every time. But the cows then are being restricted twice every day. They are being restricted in how much they eat. They're never being fully fed. And particularly we find with our young stock, the youngest cows, those first lactation animals, they struggle under that system. And it's about which cow can eat. There's only a certain amount of available pasture, which cow can eat it the fastest. And once we move away from that to a 24, 36-hour break, at least for two, if it's 36-hour break, for 2 of the 3 grazings, they're fully fed. And the third grazing, they are restricted and they are having to eat down into that residual. And it's about getting that balance between intake driving animal performance and utilization of all the grass available. And if we move to that 12-hour break, yes, we would increase utilization but reduce animal performance. I suppose
Interesting.
we at peak would be feeding virtually no other supplement for those when the cows are at their peak milk production. Now, our cows peak at 2.3 kilos of milk solids, which is what, little over 5 pounds of fat and protein per cow per day. And for that, they need to be eating about 18 kilos of grass dry matter. It'll be very difficult to do that in a 12-hour break system and graze to our optimum residuals.
Interesting. I appreciate that. There's another question in there. How much fluctuation in daily milk yield do you see on the 36, in that one paddock for 36 hours?
Yeah, you would see significant fluctuations. I suppose we don't measure it accurately because our milk is collected every 48 hours. Okay, so you have a mixture in the tank, and that like it's a 48-hour time snap you get of how much milk we've just produced. And in terms of milk, like um we're focused on kilos of milk solids. Okay, so kilograms of fat and protein. And I say we about 2.2 kilos of fat and protein we'll at peak. But you can, if we look at the supply pattern throughout a month, okay, and you see it'll go up and down by 5-10%, but it's driven more by other factors like weather comes into it. Like if you have wet periods, the cows won't be able to achieve that intake. And there's also human error. Like we want to graze out the paddocks. If we go too tight, we will restrict the cows more. And it's all about getting that balance right. Like if you under graze, or if you give the cows more than their requirement, and you have a higher residual right through that period in April, May, you will get consistent high performance, even with 36, 48-hour breaks. But you will have poor quality sward that will build up as the season progresses.
Very interesting. We're getting down there on time. There is another question in the chat, which is a very interesting one. Are there Irish farms that are experimenting with a higher diversity of grasses other than the perennial ryegrass, stockpiling or longer rest periods for pastures without harvesting as much surplus?
Yeah, so generally the Irish farmers leave the experimenting to us, to Teagasc, and they didn't come and look at it and critically analyze it for us. But I suppose the one in terms of diversity, what there a lot of it focus on is incorporating other species. So our swards generally would be perennial ryegrass with white clover. There's a lot of focus at the moment of incorporating species like red clover into grazing swards. Traditionally, red clovers like lucerne would have been more incorporated as a silage sward. There is also a lot of interest in chicory and plantain and incorporating those into pastures. They give significant benefits for a very short period. They're not very persistent, but they give significant benefits for a very short number of years, maybe 2-3 years post sowing. And it's very significant in New Zealand. They're trying to incorporate plantain to reduce nitrate leaching. There are some other species of grasses that are being considered and being tried, such as timothy and fescue. They're being looked at from benefits from potential drought resistance for parts of the country where we do get drought, but we don't get much drought. But they'd have very little in terms of the amount of them being sown is very, very small. In terms of the longer rest periods, there is focus, I suppose, in the autumn. I suppose we'll use the rest period to carry feed from the surplus into the deficit in the autumn. So we extend the rotation. That would be a norm. So you're effectively stockpiling, um, where you're carrying the letting the whole farm cover rise up and increasing the rotation length. Because grass is vegetative at that stage, your knot quality isn't deteriorating as fast, but it does deteriorate some element. But you're balancing that with shifting feed from the surplus into the deficit, and therefore not having to conserve it as silage. But there is a balance there, and it's a real, I suppose, fine balance where we carry our farm cover to in late September.
Um, there are not any other questions, and the timing is perfect because we're 1 minute before the top of the hour. This has been really informative, and I, on behalf of everybody participating, really want to thank you for preparing and presenting this to us today. I want to remind everybody that the third and final webinar in the series is going to be 3 weeks from today, on the 12th of March at the same time. And you should already have the Zoom link from having registered. And in that, we're going to cover things related to the seasonality of dairy, having to breed, have reproductive performance for a tight calving window, and having to deal with labor and cash flow issues. And hopefully we'll talk about profitability some. I also want to mention that we're hoping, together with the Northeast Dairy Business Innovation Center, to put together a couple of trips to Ireland this year. And I say hopefully because the federal government issues that we're having may cause some problems. But in May, we're hoping to put together a trip for people who support dairy farmers, and can go on this trip to Ireland to learn about how dairy farmers are supported there. And then in the fall, when our farmers are more able to leave the farm, have a farmer trip over there to spend some time on some farms and really learn the nitty-gritty of how they're managing. So I mentioned this. If you haven't seen this, a word of these trips already, if you're interested in the May trip as a support person, please email me. I sent the email reminder yesterday, so you have my address, and let me know. Otherwise, thank you again, Padraig, and I hope to see everybody in 3 weeks' time.